Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Our objective today is to finish Unit 2. This is a little quicker than we expected, but we've got some things coming up next week, some changes that I'll go over with you in person, and then I'll post the announcements on Google Classroom. Some things are going to shift. So we're going to try to wrap up our unit today. We're going to really just sort of swing through the last portions of Genesis 2, the last portions of Genesis 1 and all of Genesis 2 this morning. Um, to try to wrap up to give us space here at the end of this week, not only for our vocab quiz, but to begin reviewing for our test. Okay, let's just jump right in. We want to jump into day 6 and talk about sort of the setting that God is setting up for humanity and the garden. So let's see. He says that's day 5. Day 6. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So here we saw that first part of day 6, God establishing the land creatures, right? Now we shift to the second part. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree that has with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps along the ground, and everything that has the breath of life in it, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and morning on the sixth day. So let's back up. He says, "Let us make man in our image." So here we have that idea that humanity, human beings, male and female, are images of God. So what does that mean? Well, first, let's look at that phrase, "let us." Now, three different possibilities here. If you were in class, I'd say, what does the us mean? Why is God speaking in the first person plural? Um, and three options here. Many would say, well, isn't it the Trinity? Right. Certainly, God is including himself in this. So undoubtedly, we have a reference to Trinity here, though it would be only after the New Testament that this would become really evident, or that people would begin to realize, like God is one and yet plural, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So this us here must mean the Trinity. Um, but other options. Well, another option is that kings would use what we call like the royal we. So the king would speak in the plural as the king represents the nation. The nation is a plurality of individuals. Therefore, he says we. Possible, if not likely. But the other option here is that God is speaking not like to himself, but actually speaking with the angels, like the council. We see this in the early chapters of Job, that God is sort of counseling with the angels who appear to have some responsibility, some rule. Um, so he says, "Let us make man in our image," and that view that he's speaking to sort of the council of angels was really widely held for a long, long time and is, well, plausible. So just as angels we'll see in chapter 3, given some responsibility over some aspects of creation, God is establishing humans in like fashion to rule over the earth. Whichever view we take of the us, what becomes clear is that humanity is to reflect God's rule and reign on the earth. What we're going to argue is that this is to be understood, and I think we've mentioned this already, or we've implied it already, that the right understanding here is rooted in that idea of suzerain vassaltry, is rooted in that idea of covenant, that God is the high king, and he creates us to be his sort of vassal kings, his representative kings on the earth. That the way the world is supposed to know who God is through us, his image. Um, so God gives humanity rulership, dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So he says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So notice there's not a distinction between men and women here. Um, God created both. Both are in his image, and both equally. Even if we're going to see later on that there's a division of roles or division of labor in culture or by gender, even if we're going to see here both equally in the image of God. Not one is given a higher status over the other. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion." Again, he reiterates that rulership over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over everything, or sorry, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, and over everything that moves on the earth. So he says, look, be fruitful and multiply. So part of what God says is what we see God creates. He says, humanity procreate. Part of our design, our purpose is to have children. So for really all of the history of the people of God, it was assumed that you would get married and have children if you were able. And we're going to see many examples really early on of families struggling with infertility and God being like God coming through and providing for them. But we see in these early stories, Abraham and Isaac, um, the struggle that very real struggle of wanting children, of knowing that in some sense like it's our design to have children, and and the pain of not being able to fulfill that. So he says, "Be fruitful and multiply." So part of what it means to be human is to desire to procreate, and is to procreate, right? And this is going to very clearly like shape our perspective on marriage. These other so-called marriages that have become popular, become legal in our day, really fall short because they don't make sense with the purpose of humanity. Part of humanity's purpose is that fruitfulness and multiplication, having children, is possible. And these other sort of fraudulent so-called marriages don't provide that. These other views of humanity actually destroy the ability to be fruitful and multiply, rather than like encourage it. So we have here a sort of a clear definition of human purpose to be fruitful and multiply, to rule over the earth and subdue it. Now, let's be clear: dominion and submission does not mean abuse. Those are not the same thing. To care for, like right parents rightly rule over and at times subdue their children, not as a means of like abuse, but as a means of shepherding, a means of guiding, a means of disciplining and helping that child grow from, toddler who throws tantrums and poops their pants, to fully functional adult. Again, that's the goal. As sinners, we don't do that perfectly, but what we have here is not a command from God to use and abuse the earth for its ultimate purpose, but no, rule over it in order to care for it. So God gives them every plant yielding seed on the face of the earth. So all like plants free reign, eat whatever plants you want. And then again, we get this verse here, verse 30, which is a little bit more difficult to translate. And there's some controversy here as to whether we translated it correctly. And again, translation controversy isn't super common, but translation difficulty isn't unknown. Um, it says, to every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and to everything that creeps along the earth and everything that has the breath of life in it, I have given every green plant for food. Again, one of my Genesis professors, argued that this really ought to be that God gave humanity permission to eat every beast, every bird, every creeping thing that has the breath of life in it, as well as every green plant for food. Again, it adjusts maybe our view of the garden, um, but we don't. Is it a huge point? No, probably not. Not for us, at least today. So God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and morning on the sixth day. So here we get that wrap up of day six, with that clear, and there was evening and morning language. And then we move to day seven, which again is really different. We've looked at this already. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that He had done. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, and in the day that the Lord made the heavens and the earth, or the earth and the heavens. Now, the story resets here. We're going to get a description. We've had that sort of cosmic view, all heaven and earth being created, plants and animals and all that. Now we're going to shift into a focus on the garden. It says, when no bush of the field had yet grown, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Now, this sounds like it's contradicting Genesis 1, right? Genesis 1, day 3, God establishes plants. And then on day 6, God creates human beings. Well, it says when no bush of the field had was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up. The Lord hadn't caused rain. God formed formed man from the dust of the ground. Now, sounds different, but again, we cautioned against reading Genesis 1 in a strictly like linear or historical fashion. We said probably what we're looking at here is cosmology, right? God's establishing, like in poetry, the relationships between habitat and inhabitants. And maybe these days are not just poetry, but literal days in heaven that are God speaking things into existence, but it's only at that point when everything is complete that really our space and time really explodes into existence, right? Like God sort of hits the on button is how we visualize it. But I think what we have here is not a contradiction, but what we have is a description of the time of year and the sort of environment where where the garden was going to be. Okay, like, what do you mean? Well, what we have here, I think, is a description that it's springtime. That, well, nothing was growing in the fields, in the farmable land, because, well, it wasn't that time yet. There was, there, it hadn't rained yet, and there wasn't anyone to work the ground. So what we have here is sort of a springtime reference. At least what we would think of as spring. God's going to create human beings in the springtime to do the farming. But that seems sort of strange. But remember, this was an agrarian people. This was a people who lived as shepherds and as farmers. So these are terms that they're going to understand. Some of these terms are really confusing to us. And there's been some sort of wild speculation that's happened around this text, I think because we misunderstand the environment. It said God had not caused had not caused it to rain on the land, and a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the earth. So some have argued that prior to the flood, it never rained. In fact, the first time it ever rained was the flood. That seems pretty wild, and not reading this in its context. And this whole idea, and again, they're saying, like, look, it didn't rain, like a mist would rise from the earth that would water the ground. So it was a totally different environment. No, not so much. When we go to the Middle East and we see how the Middle East functions, how Israel in particular functions, we realize this isn't a description of something unique or foreign at all. Remember, this is southern Israel. This is the Negev. This is the sort of the desert region of Judea. Um, and hopefully you can see this all right. Notice that we have sheep being shepherded here on a hillside that looks, well, barren. But maybe you can see, depending on how good the computer screen is and how your room is lit, sometimes you can sort of see that there's actually some green here in this. Um, these sheep are not rock-eating sheep. Imagine that, right? They're not rock-eating sheep. But Israel, and here I should have an Israel map for you. Normally I would draw one on the board. Israel, maybe I can do that. Let's skip it. Israel uh, is borders the Mediterranean Sea, right? You get the Mediterranean Sea, and then you've got Israel here. Um, so to the west is the Mediterranean Sea, and then you have Israel. Well, here in the desert in Judea, it never rains. Sometimes, quite literally, it's never rained in like known history in this portion of the Judean desert. Now, what does happen is every night, or at least almost every night, you get a warm breeze that kicks up from the west over the Mediterranean and passes over the land of Israel, including the desert. Now, that air from the west, from the Mediterranean, is moist. And what happens is that in the very early morning hours, it leaves dew all over the nation. And again, maybe you've seen it when you drive into campus. You ever notice when you drive into campus, many of you haven't been on our campus very long, that there will be a haze over the field hockey and soccer fields, sort of a mist that just sits over them. That's the dew forming, right? If you haven't seen it, you will. Lord willing, we're back on campus. Um, well, this is what happens in Israel. It looks like a mist rising from the ground, but it's actually the dew settling. So even in the desert, you get dew. And in this portion of the desert, in this picture that you see here, in the very early morning hours, this is sunrise. Sun isn't even fully risen yet. Between the rocks and the sand here in the desert, little tufts of grass will grow up. And what it means to have like a good shepherd, what it means to say that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me into green pastures. This is green pastures in southern Israel. It doesn't get any greener than this. So what it means to have a good shepherd is that, well, you have a good shepherd that leads you on a western facing hill, a hill that's going to get lots of dew, where there's going to be just enough grass for the moment. He doesn't make you lie down in green pastures like fields full of belly deep alfalfa so that you can just lie there and get fat. No, he leads you. What it means to have a good shepherd is that he leads you one mouthful to the next, to the next, to the next. You always have just enough. Does that make sense? Um, so what we have here in this picture, in Genesis 2, is that uh, is that um, we have a desert mountain scene. Dew is falling. It's preparing the land to be planted. Now, here maybe we're probably not talking about desert in the same way that we're talking about it in those pictures, because it implies that there's going to be crops grown. So we have some place that's a little bit more moist than the desert. And what we find is that 70% of the land of Israel is desert, and The other 30% is farmable. And it's be significant for us. Both sometimes very close side by side. We'll see that more later. Um, so God, here we have like a mountain scene, a land not unlike Israel, where God takes dust of the ground and forms it into a human being and breathes into it the breath of life. But remember that word breath is the word ruach. Say ruach. Ruach is the same word for spirit, breath, and wind, right? So he breathes into us the breath of life. He spirits into us the spirit of life. He winds in us the wind of life, or breathes into us the spirit of life. God is sharing his spirit with us that we would live. So we have a specially formed, specially created humanity made out of the dust of the ground. Some of us find ourselves like really offended at the idea of evolution because, well, it says that we're made of monkeys. Here it's even worse, right? Here we're made out of dirt. Okay. So when you call someone a dirt bag, you're being sort of literal. Just kidding. Okay. So God breathes his spirit into us to give us life. And so God here does the initial planting. God planted a garden in Eden in the east. Um, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So God plants a garden. And here the word for garden is more like small farm. Okay. Um, and out of the ground, the Lord God made to spring up every every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the Spirit of God, the tree of life was in the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first was the Pishon. It flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there was gold, and the gold of the land was good. Bdellium and onyx stone were there. And the name of the second river was the Gihon. Uh, it was uh, it is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth is the Euphrates. And God took the man and put him in the garden to work it and keep it. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree that is in the Garden of Eden. Or sorry, that is in the garden. Well, let's pause for a minute. What's happening here? Well, here we have God planting a garden. Okay. We have God planting a garden. We need to look at that word garden. In Hebrew, it's the word gan. Okay, so what? Well, a gan is a particular type of farm. A gan is a terraced farm. Now, not a terrorist, but a terrace. Do you know what terrace means? Well, imagine a mountainside or a hillside, right? Let me see if I can draw one here for you in a way that you can see. A terrace, in terms of farming, means to um, sort of cut steps into the side of a hill. Can you see that? To cut steps into the side of a hill or a mountain. And what God has done is he has planted like a vineyard or an olive grove or maybe we would say an orchard onto the terraced hillside. Um, we see this sort of farming all over the land of Israel. This is really common. So you cut steps into the hill or into the mountainside, um, and uh, and you plant your fields, your vineyards, your orchards, your gardens onto those flat steps. And what they have to do is they have to build stone retaining walls to hold the dirt back. Those are actually really interesting. We will get a chance to talk about those more because it says something about the nature of like life and farming and community and generations. If one generation doesn't maintain those uh, if one generation doesn't maintain those retaining walls, what'll happen is that you'll get a landslide and like you'll lose your farm. But it won't be that generation. It'll be the generation after it or after that. See, what you do matters not just because it impacts you, but because it impacts the generations after you. In Israel, you understand that you farm and maintain the land that God has given you, not just for you, but for the generations to come. The choices you make, like even right now as freshmen, the choices you make are going to impact your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids. Yikes. I don't say that to push pressure on you, but I say that to say, like, what you do right now matters. What you do matters. Okay? Your your concussions right now matter. Your video game time now matters. Your like dating matters. Your grades, not so much your grades, your knowledge, the reading you do, what you bother to learn, what you bother to give your time to matters. Not just for you, but for your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids. That seems hard to imagine, and yet that really is the case for many of us. Like we're here, like I have this job because my parents and grandparents and great grandparents were faithful people. You're here not because you're here in a private school, not because you've worked real hard to like pay for this, but because your parents and your grandparents did. Does that make sense? What we have, much of what we have is not our own. It's inherited from those who have gone before us. So we're, like we need to remember, like, oh, what we do matters because it doesn't just impact me. My life is not my own. My life is the result of and is the cause of like other life. Okay. So God planted this terraced farm on a hillside or a mountainside, and he called it Eden. Or the region was called Eden. And he planted this really good grove, this really good orchard. And he places in the midst of the garden the tree of life. It's interesting. It seems that, and it's not entirely clear, that as long as human beings, like what kept human beings from dying, was their access to the tree of life. When God punishes Adam and Eve for rebelling against him, he doesn't like curse them with illness. He doesn't curse them with death. Just the opposite. He says, you cannot eat from the tree of life. He cuts them off from the tree of life. That's what causes them to die. Interesting. Then he says, and in the midst of the garden was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Curious. Let's come back to that in a minute. That's going to be the one that's really important to us. But notice what he says about, notice the description of Eden. He says, a river flowed out of Eden and divided into four rivers, which went off in four different directions. This, I think, is really clear that what we're talking about here is a mountain, right? On a flat piece of land, you don't have a river that divides and juts off into four different directions. What you have is a stream coming down out of the mountains that divides off into four different directions. And notice he names the rivers, right? He says, um, he says the first is the Pishon that travels through the whole land of Havilah. The second is the Gihon that travels the land of Cush. The fourth is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria. The third is the Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth is the Euphrates. So what Moses means to do here is to set Eden in real time and space. This is not some like mystical land. Now, what is interesting, like Gihon, Pishon, Tigris, and Euphrates, they're real rivers. They're known rivers. Yet, they don't share a common source today and don't seem to have shared a common source even in Moses' lifetime. But what we have here, like, is well known river names, known place names. So Moses is saying, look, at some point there was a mountain where all these rivers sort of originated. No, we know rivers move. We know geography moves. And you think, well, you had Noah's flood. You had a cataclysmic flood that shifted land around. Anyway, if you ever there's just lots of examples of rivers and bodies of water shifting and moving as things silt in, as earthquakes happen, all this stuff. So I think what Moses is trying to say is like, look, this is local here, this is nearby, but doesn't exist in the same way now. So look, don't go looking for the Garden of Eden. You're not going to find it, and if you did, you probably wouldn't recognize it because I think what we have here is a fairly typical Middle Eastern mountainside farm. Um, so Moses is not meaning to set up some mystical far off place. He's establishing like a real like a place in real space and time. Um, which is interesting, right? Um, Now, he says, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. So notice, God gives Adam and Eve, God gives it, well, here, just Adam, meaningful labor. He says, you're going to work the farm. You're going to keep it. Um, and I think the idea here is that the Garden of Eden, let me illustrate again. I know this is super low tech, forgive me. But the Garden of Eden is, well, let's see. The Garden of Eden is little. It's just a little farm, a farm big enough for one family. But as Adam and Eve's family grows, the idea is to expand that garden for the size of their family out until it fills the whole world. Sometimes we get this idea, I'm not sure where it's from, that the Garden of Eden was like the entire world. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because what God's going to do is he's going to kick him out of the garden. God plants this garden, it's big enough for Adam and his family, just big enough for Adam and his family. And as their family grows, they're going to take that uncultivated land around them and expand it out. God says, work it and keep it. So work it, grow it, expand it, build it, and keep it. Protect it. That's an interesting thing. Keep it, protect it. God's setting up right away that there's going to be threats in this garden. Take note. The Lord commanded the man, saying, you may eat of every tree that's in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Whoa, what's up with this? Well, here again, the ancient Near Eastern context helps. Trees, many of the peoples in the ancient world were wanderers. We would call them like nomads. Um, Today they're called Bedouin. Okay, they follow food and they follow water. Okay, they take their flocks and their herds and they travel around, grazing on different hillsides, going from water source to water source. When there was an issue in the community, there was often a tree in the region that would be the sort of central meeting place in that region, where the elders of the community, the sheiks, the elders, the judges, would gather when there was a dispute and make decisions. So around a particular tree was often the place of like the courthouse. Okay, when the people began to when the farming communities ended up building cities, the city gate would take the place of the tree as the like courthouse, as the place where the governing body met. Okay, so here we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, again, this is sort of the origin of that idea that a tree would be the place of judgment. It says the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, often this has been interpreted to say that Adam and Eve didn't know good from evil. They didn't know evil, therefore they didn't know good from evil. They were sort of ignorant, and that was God's plan. But that doesn't make any sense, does it? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't take like we can know good without having experienced evil, right? I know it's good not to do crystal meth. I don't need to do crystal meth to know that it's bad. The evidence is clear, right? I don't need to drink sour milk, spoiled milk, to know that real milk or that non-spoiled milk is good, right? I don't need to eat rotten food to know that like like that, again, non-rotten food is delicious. Like I don't need to do that, right? I can know good without having experienced bad. Does that make sense? But notice what this tree does. This is so God has given Israel homework, right? He says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, make the garden grow, right? Make it prosperous. But then he gives them one rule. He says, do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So what bad do they know? They know good from bad already, just because of the placement of the tree. They know eating from that tree is bad. Does that make sense? Now, what makes it bad? Is this like sin fruit? Just fruit full of like wicked and evil. If you eat it, do you turn into a zombie, right? Well, no. What makes the fruit bad? The fruit is no different than any of the other trees, apparently. Because we're going to see later that, well, Eve looks at it, it looks good for food. How does she know? Well, because it's like the other ones. What makes the tree different is the command of God. God says, do not eat from the fruit of this tree. Okay? Don't eat from the fruit of this tree. So that's what makes it different. But that's the whole point. The tree is there so that Adam and Eve can discern good from evil. This is the place where they were to judge good from evil. Because, well, what's going to come in and tempt them? Well, again, Satan's going to come in. He's going to say, look, eat the fruit. Did they know enough to not eat the fruit? You bet they did. God said, don't. So the whole point of the tree was that they were to judge there. There's an ancient practice called post-mortem desecration of the dead. Yikes. That's a big phrase, right? Post-mortem desecration of the dead. What it means is that after death, you desecrate, you like humiliate, for lack of a better term, the body of the dead person. Ew, gross. Why? So what they believed, think about Egypt. Think about where they came from. They did all sorts of preparation in ancient Egypt. They mummified, right, to prepare the person for the afterlife. They thought that what you did to the body made a difference in terms of what happened to them in the afterlife. So while they do all these fancy preparations for the people that they honored and respected in Egypt, all sorts of mummification, right? If there was a murderer, if there was someone who was really wicked, what they would do is that they would hang that body on a tree to rot in the sun and be eaten by animals and insects and birds. Okay, you're like, ew, gross. We actually see an example of this in the story of Joseph. The cupbearer is restored to his position. The baker is executed, and his body is hung on a tree, and the birds eat his flesh. Yuck. But what this meant to them is if you weren't given a proper burial, it was instead of given a proper burial, you were hung on a tree. It was a way of saying to the community, we believe this person was so wicked that they're cursed to hell. Thanks. Um, Again, it's symbolic. But a powerful symbol. And what's interesting is that the Bible comes alongside this. In Deuteronomy, it says, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree. But he says, look, it's just a symbol. So if you need to communicate to the community, this person was really, really wicked, execute them, hang their body on a tree, but take it down before nightfall. Bury them before nightfall, because it's just a symbol. It's just a way of communicating. And if you leave it up, the whole land has become unclean. That's a little bit complicated, but we'll come back to that. Okay. So here, this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is the place where Adam and Eve, again, being vassal kings, being representatives of God's character, were to execute judgment. So if something came in and said, eat from this tree, they were to say, no, smash its head and hang its body on the tree. They knew good from evil because the tree existed. God's intention was never to keep us ignorant. It was never to cut us off from good and evil. In fact, what we'll argue next unit is that Adam and Eve would have learned good and evil, in fact, better by rightly judging the serpent, not giving into it. Now, so then God saw. So God places the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the center of the garden. He said, tree of life, they could eat. Whether they ever did or not, we don't know. We know that after they sinned, they didn't eat. Then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he says, don't eat from it. and that we do know that they sort of they did tragically eat from. So the Lord God said, "Now it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." So here, notice, like God allows Adam to feel the pain of like loneliness. And often we assume that a perfect world would be sort of devoid of pain, devoid of any sort of difficulty, devoid of even work. That's not God's picture of perfect. That's not God's picture of sinless. It's not God's picture of good. Good is effortful. Good experiences like loss and lack. Um, so God says, "Well, I will find a helper fit for him." And notice God like involves Adam in the process. Out of the ground the Lord had caused every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens to be formed, every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens. And he brought them to the man to see what he would call them. So God had done all sorts of naming in Genesis 1. Now God's going to involve Adam in the naming. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. And the man gave names to all the livestock and all the birds of the heavens and every beast of the field. Now, again, is this every single one? Did this take years and years, or was it just a representative sample? Not sure. But Adam worked, and like at the end, it was like it appears to be like sort of frustrated. None of them, including dogs, mind you, were a suitable helpmate, suitable helper for him. So God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man. And while he was sleeping, he took a rib. Now, God takes a rib from Adam. Does this mean that every man has one less rib than women? No. If I cut off my finger, would any children born to me after this be missing a finger? No, that's craziness. That's not how it works. Did Adam have one less rib than Eve? Yeah, but their children were born with a full set of ribs. Okay, let's not be like weird and superstitious about this. How these things like end up in Sunday school curriculum is like crazy talk. I don't know. I don't know what's happened. Um, so the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he was sleeping, he took a rib. So he separated out part of Adam, and out of it he made a woman, Eve. He brought her to the man, and he's blown away. And the only thing he can do is like cry out in poetry. At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because when I saw her, I was like, whoa, man. No, sorry. She should be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And there's like a Hebrew pun here. She should be called Isha, for she was taken out of Ish. Something like that. Like woman is literally out of man in Hebrew. Um, so he cries out like finally a suitable helper. And notice here it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. That's beautiful, right? So here we have out of man, out of one, a separation and the establishment of two. And then in marriage, the two are made one again. So it's not that, so in being married, it's not that like there's two of us. It's not that I have like my life and my responsibilities, and my wife, she has her life and her responsibilities. And there's a sense in which that's true. But we're really one. We're one family unit. Um, Two parts, in fact, three parts. Um, with our daughter, but um, uh, we're one. Okay. No longer is it just me. It's not just like me and my wife. It's us. Okay. So, and here we have something that's really subversive, because this is not the normal way of expressing like life in the ancient Near East. It says, "A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife." What you normally have, and even throughout most of Israelite history, is a woman leaves her family and becomes like one with her husband and a part of his family. But here, like God's saying, look, guys, when you get married, your primary loyalty, your primary commitment is to your wife and her needs, not like your dad. Okay, and that's gonna press against sort of the cultural norm. Again, nothing like again, God's gonna call us to honor our parents, but not at the expense of our wives, right? Okay, so God splits the two. He takes out from Adam to make Eve and brings them back together as one flesh in marriage. And then it says, and the man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed. This doesn't necessarily mean that they never wore clothing. It's a statement of status. There's no shame here. There's no sin here. They weren't afraid to be naked together. And that's going to be a hint, like that's going to come up again, hopefully, as you know, hopefully you know the Genesis 3 story. That what it's saying is that there's no shame. And look, this is how marriage is supposed to be, right? That you can be naked in front of one another and we're not ashamed. But the reality is that we're deeply ashamed of our bodies, right? We're deeply ashamed. And in many ways, in a sinful world, rightly so. We don't want to parade our bodies around. We don't want to be a spectacle, or at least we shouldn't, right? And yet, in the confines of marriage, there ought not be shame. And so we struggle, right, as sinful creatures, being like ashamed when we shouldn't be, and maybe not being ashamed when we ought to be. But here we have like there is no shame because there is no sin. They have like perfect, unadulterated, unpolluted, perfect relationship, perfect love, perfect unity in marriage. That's what God's called us to, male and female, in marriage, procreating, ruling, farming, caring for plants and animals, caring for one another, caring for God's good creation. God's given us a beautiful picture of what it means to be human here in Genesis 2, and lays the groundwork for understanding why Genesis 3 is so tragic. All right, thanks for your attention. Hopefully you found this like helpful. Maybe it's new, maybe it's just review. Either way, um, uh, uh, may you grow in your wisdom, your understanding of how to like honor God as male and female, how to honor God with your whole life, and how to take care of the world that God has, or the little piece of the world that God has put you in charge of. God bless. Love you. See you later.